So I'm going to start today off with, so of course this year during election year, but with any other year and for many, many years, celebrities have influenced people to be able to vote, to be able to go a certain direction, to really kind of say or influence what they were thinking. So I want you to think for a second, who are some of the most influential celebrities this year that probably swayed or made people vote based upon things that they said or things that they did? And raise your hand if you can tell me some of these people that are in there. Yes, sir. Okay, Kanye West. Depends on which Kanye it is during which day. But yeah, Kanye West would be one that would have an influence of a vote. All right, what else? Okay, Lil Pump, whenever he came up to the stage. Yes. Okay, there's another. I forgot about him. All right, what else? Okay, DeAndre Hopkins. Patrick Mahomes bought all of these different voting machines to go and try to turn Kansas City, the stadium itself, into a voting place. Okay, keep going. Think about it. Y'all are missing like the number one biggest one that there was. No, he's too worried about trying to clear his name from being in violence. LeBron James. LeBron James was the largest one as far as that goes. Think of, and everything that y'all have named so far has been necessarily professional athletes. But then you got the other side of it, which is movie stars. Okay, so you got The Rock, that was a big one. You got Oprah, that was a big one. You got Tom Hanks. Matthew McConaughey was another big one. Kind of read off. What's that? I don't know. I didn't hear a lot. He didn't make the list as far as that goes. So let me read to you some of the big ones that were there. Taylor Swift was one. Beyonce, Colin Kaepernick, Beyonce, Cardi B. A lot of, let's see, Oprah Winfrey. Johnson came in at 45%. Winfrey came in at 38%. James was 32%. Hanks, Kid Rock. And I think those are going to be some of the major ones that popped out at it. So, and I guess it goes with the idea of Leonardo DiCaprio, Alicia Keys, John Legend, De Niro was one, Chris Evans, the Kardashians, the Jenners. So some of those were voted ones that were there. Billie Eilish was one. Lizzo was another one. Okay. So what is kind of scary about that? What's scary in your opinion about celebrities, about athletes, about people in movies that have a very, very heavy influence on other people, that's where they get their trustworthy ideas from rather than finding out the information themselves? What's kind of scary about that, in your opinion? Okay, because they have a lot of influence, right? I mean, if somebody, we talked about yesterday with chivalry and kind of like, what were heroes? What do heroes look like? Who were they? And the power of influence that a hero has. If that's your hero, if that's the person you're looking up to, then, you're very, very heavily influenced by the decisions that they make, by the words that they speak. All right, keep going. What else? Clayton, what do you think? You're always good and opinionated. Nothing? Barton's got one for me. I know it. Brain's spinning over there. So let me ask you this. Do you think that they may be an expert on their sport? They may be an expert on acting. Do you believe that they're an expert on politics? No. Okay. Because it's easy. And let's say that, you as a kid, you see something that goes on in the school system and you're like, that needs to be changed. We need to do this. But you don't understand that there's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to Z, those steps that have to be taken to get from A to Z. It's not as simple as this or this or this, and that fixes the problem. There's a lot of other steps. There's a lot of other things that go behind the scenes that get you to where you're supposed to be at. However, if you don't know those ins and outs, then you're not really an expert on it. You're just someone who's kind of griping about what they're doing. You know what I mean? And what we're going to talk about today is the power of influence, which turned into the battle between the church and the king or the emperor at the time. And the church had an extremely, extremely heavy influence on what the people were listening to, on what the people were doing, and how they could control the masses even more than the king or the emperor. Okay, so before this time, the main people in charge of everything was the king or was the emperor. That was it. Whatever they said, that was the law. They went. The church was kind of second fiddle. We talked about it in feudalism when we drew up the pyramid, and we talked about the king at the top, the pope, the priest, the nobles, the knights, the peasants, all the way down. But the king was at the top, and whatever the king said, the people had to relay that message and follow that message. The church was the second figure that went along. The church is going to gain a lot of steam, and they're going to actually get to the point of where we are today, that there has to be a separation of church and state. So that way the people who already listen to the church, because that's their salvation, that's their path to heaven, that's their way out of the bad life that they're living, is also not telling them what laws govern them and what they can and cannot do aside from their religion that's there. Okay. So I said, amid the weak central government in feudal Europe, the church emerged as a powerful institution. It shaped the lives of people from all social classes. And as the church expanded its political role, strong rulers began to question the Pope's authority. Dramatic power struggles unfolded in the Holy Roman Empire. Okay. The interesting thing about the Holy Roman Empire, honestly, it turned out to not be holy, and it turned out not to be Roman, like we associate the Roman Empire later on, but it was still tabbed the Holy Roman Empire, based upon historians. The struggles unfolded between the Holy Roman Empire and the scene of mounting tension between the popes and the emperors. All right, so what you got to first understand is the entire idea of the Holy Roman Empire was a battle between the Pope and the emperor or the king. Okay, it was a power struggle. Who has more power? Who is going to be able to understand the most that's there? So if we go back to our feudalistic idea, which again, feudalism is all about land, and there's the king at the top, there's the Pope or the priest, all right? There's the nobles that are there. All of the knights we talked about are the protectors, and then below them for everything else is the people, okay? So the people in the feudal system have to only answer to the king. Separately from religion, they have to answer to the Pope. And remember, if you draw this line about right here, this is 10% of the people, and this is 90% of the people down here in the feudalistic idea. All right. So as this goes on, the king and the emperor are actually going to be equal to the Pope and the church. And sometimes the Pope is going to have greater power than the king or the emperor. So that's going to make people want to revolt against that. If the king or the emperor is in this power struggle to kind of get up here on the top of the food chain, okay, if that tithe, if that tax, if that land payment is going to go to them, that kind of flips the feudal system over to the idea where the church can have more power. The church can have more of a tithe. The church actually becomes more dominant than the actual king or queen in the palace that we were talking about defending in the time. All right, so this is their feudal system pyramid. There's the Pope at the top. There's the bishops, which are right below them. There's the priests, and then there's the people. You still get the 90%. You still get the 10% as far as the 10% of the top three and the 90% of the people. But they're not having to lay down laws to them to make them obey. They're laying down laws from God to allow them to get salvation. All right. So it kind of goes through the beginning of it, talks about the idea that in crowning Charlemagne as the emperor in 800, the church sought to influence both spiritual and political matters, the same way we were talking about athletes and actors trying to influence political matters. 300 years earlier, the Pope recognized the conflict that could arise between the two great forces. He wrote, "There are two powers by which this world is chiefly ruled. He is ruled by the sacred authority and of the authority of the priest and the king." Those are the two things that govern man. Those are the two things that have the overall rule of man. It says, the analogy is that God created two symbolic swords. One sword was religion, the other sword was political. The Pope held a spiritual sword, while the emperor wielded a political one. It said that the Pope should bow to the emperor in political matters only, and the emperor should bow to the Pope in the idea of religious matters. Did the king or the emperor generally ever bow to anyone? The king or the emperor? Was he ever looking? No, Dylan, he wasn't. He wasn't looking to bow to someone. That's the reason why he was the king or the emperor. He was the ruler of all. So if someone was asking the king or queen to bow to them, that was kind of a slap in their face. All right? And that was a challenge of their authority. So that battle is starting to get created already. It says, if each ruler kept the authority on his own realm, the two leaders could actually share power and they could live harmoniously together and they could control all of the 90% of the people. But the problem was the king wanted to make sure that he was the only one that wielded power. The church kind of wanted its foot in the door. And once it got some of its foot in the door, it completely opened up and took control. It says, in reality, though, they disagreed on the boundaries of either realm. Throughout the Middle Ages, the church and various European rulers would compete for power. All right? The biggest thing was medieval Christians live their life in a harsh way every single day. And there were certain things called sacraments that they had to do, that they had to achieve to be able to get to heaven. All right? Whether it be a baptism, so then that way they could be into the Christian faith, whether it be the way that they live their life, so that way they could, again, gain the idea of being able to be saved and go to heaven. But at the local level, the village church was a unifying force for all of their people. Talked about manners. All right? So everybody lives within this one manor. And they're still going to church every day. Okay? They're still going to church every opportunity they have, but they're also still having to listen to their king. So if the village church was the key, the Pope was the overall controller of all of that. All right? He had a lot of power because he could determine and tell the priest and the bishop what to do at that local level. All right? The same way that if a king and an emperor were in with the priest, he could tell them what to preach and tell them, hey, this is the message you need to portray to your people. So then that way they think that this is the way to salvation. So it served as a religious and social center. People worshiped together at the church. They met with other villagers. Religious holidays such as Christmas and Easter or occasions were big for festivals and celebrations. The church also created what was known as canon law. Now, this is a big one. Canon law applies to all people. That's the big part, because most of the time, canon law would only apply to the 90%. It wouldn't apply to 100% of people. So if the church comes up with laws and that double-edged sword that we said, that man is here with king and emperor and man is here with the Pope, well, now all of a sudden canon law applies to everybody and it's equally applied to everyone. All right? The idea that canon law, a church law in matters such as marriage, religious practices, the church established courts to try people accused of violating the idea. A king or an emperor could be brought upon charges of violating the church's order. If he did things that was deemed unchurch-like, he could be excommunicated. He could be kicked out of the church completely. If you're excommunicated, that means you have no opportunity to go to heaven. Okay, you could honestly be, sentenced to eternal damnation, which is a pretty powerful thing for a pope to be able to get into. Now, the other part is to interdict. It says many sacraments and religious services could not be performed on the king's land. So if the pope or the priest or the bishops here deemed, especially the pope, deemed that the king was not within rules of the religious laws, they could shut down the church on those manners. Well, I just told you that 90% of the people went to church as often as they could. How do you think those people are going to react if their church is shut down? Think they're going to be happy? No, they're not going to be happy at all. They're going to look for somebody to reopen that church. Well, if the church was closed because of the king, whether they see it as the king's fault or whether they see it as the priest's fault, they don't care. They just want their church reopened so that way they can be able to go to heaven. They're going to revolt against the king. So therefore, that power went to the pope, went to the bishop, went to the priest, because in turn, they were the ones that essentially were the puppet master of the king that was there. Okay. It says, as Christian, the king's subjects believed that without such sacraments, they might be doomed to hell. In the 11th century, excommunication and possible threats of interdicting would force a German emperor to submit to the Pope's command. So it goes on. There's an idea that the Pope has a conflict with one of the kings, one of the emperors. And as he has the conflict with the king and the emperor, he excommunicates him. The king realizes that he's about to have a revolt with all his people. He's going to lose his kingdom, because if 90% of the people, if they're interdicted and they want to go to church, the only way for them to go back to church is if the king is either dead, removed, or apologizes. He goes back in and he actually apologizes to the church. He kneels to the church, essentially, and he's trying to get back in the good graces. They forgive each other. It works out, but he has to give up some of his rights and his privileges. They meet a compromise to where, he can veto who's the bishop or the priest, but in turn, the Pope still has the biggest say of who's the next guy. So instead of the king appointing the priest, the nobles, and the knights, now it's the Pope appointing the bishop and the priest, and the Pope moves up here to the top. So at times, the Pope is actually greater than the king. Religion has a very, very powerful stance during this time. All right. So the idea of the church growing not only in numbers, but in strength and in power, and separating itself a little bit from the idea of an emperor, from a king, and being in power was a big, big deal. Okay. Lay investiture, a ceremony in which kings and nobles appointed church officials. All right. So that big deal of a king appointing the nobles to the church. Okay. If the king appointed these guys at the next level, they were going to respect the king. So the Pope wanted to be able to appoint the bishop and the priest and the nobles. So that way, this level right here would turn into the church and not the king controlling the church. It was more of the church controlling the king. So that was a big, big switch in what the Holy Roman Emperor was going to be able to do right there. All right. That gives you a pretty good little introduction to kind of what the empire itself is going to be, the authority that the power of the church is going to end up having. What I want you to do now is go to Canvas. And from yesterday into today's, now you have plenty of time to do this. So this is one thing that gets me. If I look back here on the moderation of the grades and you've only spent 3 minutes on something and you don't pass it, you can look back in on your PowerPoint, on your guided reading, on the notes, on the video that we're sitting there going over, and anything that's in there, that's what's going to help you answer that question. Don't just open up the worksheet and answer the questions. Make sure you check before you hit submit. So then that way you actually spend some time making sure those answers are correct. All right. You're going to answer chapter 13, section 3, which is the age of chivalry, which we talked about yesterday. And then you're going to answer 13-4, which is what we're talking about today with the battle of the Holy Roman Empire with the influence of the church. All right, so those two, there'll be 7 questions apiece. So you got 14 total questions that you got to have done and you got to put in there. Okay, any questions? All right, I'm going to turn off the Zoom and then come around the room and help you if you need it.